Hi, everyone. Welcome to Ken Michaels Radio. I'm Ken Michaels. Thanks to all of you for your support on my brand new YouTube channel, and to those of you who watched my very first video, an interview with Joey Molland of Badfinger. I'm Ken Michaels, and here on this channel, I interview lots of people connected to the Beatles and even authors of Beatle books. And that's exactly who I have on the show this time. We have the author of a brand new book, which is called, bring it up to the screen here, George Harrison on George Harrison, Interviews and Encounters. And the author, Ashley Kahn, has it as well. You might have double vision right now, but that's just fine when you're looking at George Harrison. And Ashley is also the author of a number of other books you should know about. A Love Supreme, the making of John Coltrane's signature album. Kind of Blue, the making of Miles Davis's masterpiece. The House That Train Built, The Best of Impulse Records, and The Universal Tone, Carlos Santana's autobiography. Welcome, Ashley Kahn, to Ken Michaels Radio.
Hey, Ken. Great to be here. I should just add that the George Harrison book I'm the editor of. There's a lot of my writing in it, but I'm listed as editor.
Right. Well, you've compiled all these interviews that George did throughout his career, Beatles up to the end of his death, a few speeches as well, even something he did in 2000. There was a Q&A on Yahoo and MSN. That was one of the last things he did.
Yeah, one of the chat online chats back in the very early days of online chats.
Right.
When Yahoo and MSN were leaders, and AOL and CompuServe, going back in what feels like ancient history now.
Everything moves so quickly. So
most definitely.
Why don't we start by just telling the folks what the purpose was behind this book?
Sure, I'd love to. Well, the idea was to sort of allow George to speak for himself, an unfiltered view of George as much as possible through interviews, public statements, conversations that he had over the years, and to cover the width and the breadth of the whole George Harrison experience. So not just the Beatles, not just his solo years as a music performer, but his deep spirituality, his sense of social purpose and service. Speaking specifically of projects like Concert for Bangladesh, and then of course his efforts in the film world, and of course his life as a person. So it was an attempt when I could to find the original tapes of interviews and recordings, original video tapes of, or raw tapes rather, of TV appearances that he made or interviews that were done with him, or transcripts, to allow as much of George's words to come through without that sort of editorial filter. At the same time, I'm covering such a huge time period in this book from 1962 to 2001 when he passed, that I felt it necessary to create framing text, I call it, introductory text of like 3-4 paragraphs to explain the reason for this interview, where it took place. Sometimes I was able to get the writers, the original journalists, to speak about how they got that interview and what was special about that moment in time. Like this was when George came back from America, having visited the San Francisco hippie scene during the Summer of Love. This was his first interview after returning to the UK, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of history here. There's a lot of course, biography. But there's also mostly, and I'm very proud of this, it's George. It's George's voice. And it really shows how incredibly authentic this man was to himself, to his purpose, to understanding what he was supposed to be doing while he was here on this planet. I don't want to get too mystical about it, but I really do believe, that he was someone who thought that way. And he certainly proved it through his actions. but there's this consistency from his teenage years all the way up to the year that he passed away, of being very truthful with
Hmm.
himself, very honest with his feelings when he's sad or angry or upset or happy and joyful. It all comes through in these words.
Right.
And I think the last thing I want to say, sorry, Ken, for going on, but
That's right.
is that, in this digital age, you're kind of invited to go on YouTube and look at a lot of these moments in people's lives, and you can, there are posts that people do. There's an ability that you have with a book like this to sit down and really take time with it and allow George's words to come off the page and reach you in a way that you can't do it, when you're, on the laptop. And I really encourage people to try and encounter and experience George in that way too.
Yeah. What I love really about this book is that, well, I personally feel that most people are complex in nature, and George was no different. And you really get to know from, like you said, 1962 to the end of his life. There's so many topics here that are covered, and sometimes I think I really understand him and I understand him better, but then sometimes I get confused because I think that he had a lot of conflict in the way that he felt about certain things, certainly about the Beatle years, for example. But just talking about his spirituality, I want to start talking about that because you get the impression, certainly since he started learning about that and Eastern philosophy, that was the most consistent thing throughout his life. He was always saying the purpose of us being here is to find out who we are and why we're here. He was saying that up until the end of his life. Was that by far and away the most important thing in his life? Because not that I want you to give us a top 10 list here, but for a lot of people who would think family, or careers might be the most important thing, did his spirituality rise above all that?
I don't think so. I think that he saw spirituality as something that was woven into all these other priorities and pursuits and reasons to be alive and do what you're doing. I don't think he separated it. And I think that's it's not like, okay, from 10 o'clock till 12 o'clock, I'll be in the studio, laying down some new tracks. From 12 o'clock to 1, then I'm going to have lunch. And then the rest of the day is spent on spiritual matters. No, his musical expression, his family life, his devotion to friends and spiritual colleagues like in the Hare Krishna movement, etc.
Mm,
This was all part of who he was and what he did. So his actions reflected the spiritual dedication that was there. And also, I mean, his idea of spirituality changes over time, and you really get this from the book.
mm,
The idea that at first it was this love of Eastern music, of Indian music. As he falls in love with the idea of ragas, and he meets Ravi Shankar, and he
mm,
starts takes sitar lessons, and that helps open a door to the idea of looking to Eastern culture and eventually Eastern spirituality. But he's never devoted to just one swami, to one
right.
guru, to one path. Even though he is most connected with the Hare Krishna movement, which he found very inspiring, and and the Hare Krishnas had just recently moved. Sri Prabhupada, who was the leader of that movement in the 1960s, had just moved from San Francisco to London to develop and to spread their word when George met them. So that energy that they had, they were the that sort of missionary kind of zeal was something that he
Mm,
responded to, and I think that's one of the reasons why the Hare Krishna movement found a happy student in George at that moment. But as the latter years show, he was expanding his reach and his interests and where he went with this his sense of spirituality to other swaminis and gurus, etc. And so it wasn't just the Prabhupada approach, though he was involved with that.
Right. You really get a sense of how knowledgeable he was
Yeah.
about Eastern philosophy and mentioning all these different swamis and yogis and didn't he even have a building set up in London for the Hare
Well,
Krishna?
with the Hare Krishnas,
Yeah,
he donates a whole mansion
right.
to them for their London headquarters, and it's still there. I'm forgetting the name of it, but it's in North London. However, I think the other thing that is worth noting is that he's still talking about his Judeo-Christian upbringing, even towards his latter years, and he sees that as part of his kind of spiritual foundation, if you will.
Hmm.
That he's not discarding everything Western and replacing it with something else. That he has been building this idea of what a spiritual path is. And, he sees all these religious kind of stories and the Bible, etc., in a metaphoric way,
Hmm.
is how it comes across because he's able to get these different languages and traditions to work together for him. And though he would definitely not call himself Catholic, though he was raised Catholic, that
Yeah.
by the end, he is, however, he's the spirit of Christianity is something that he connects with as much as Eastern, paths.
That's interesting. He never dismisses any experience that he had in his life. It's all part of what makes you who you are.
Exactly.
So,
He was wise beyond his years in many ways. It wasn't just the spiritual thing. The way he dealt with being a Beatle and the huge fame and fortune, that came his way. And he was never someone to see that as being antithetical to his spiritual leanings or
mhm.
to the idea of public service, the idea that, what can I do that will be beneficial to maximum number of people because I've been given this gift. And that's something he talks about discussing with John Lennon, you know.
Yeah. It must have been somewhat difficult to have the private time to devote to spirituality in the midst of all that craziness from the Beatle years.
I would say it was tough to be private, period. I mean, you can see it in some of the 65 and 66 interviews. By that point, he's like, basta, as the
Mm,
Italians say. Enough,
right.
I'm trying to develop a home. In '66, he's bought his first real house, and
Mm,
Patty is living with him, and they're not married yet, but they're about to get married. But he has all these Beatles fans like stealing mailboxes and signs off of the local road, as if that was acceptable behavior or whatever, and that's what every famous person has to put up with. And they were climbing over certain walls and hedges, and he was like
mm.
really upset about it. He's like, don't they realize there's a line you can't cross? And we laugh about it now. Everybody should have such problems, but the inappropriateness of it, I think, is
Sure.
what really got to him. He said, I play music, I play rhythm guitar
Right.
in a band. What is it that I'm doing that deserves this kind of, adoration that's on that level?
Yeah. Yeah. Talk about how George had to deal with, well, the aftermath of the Beatles. Just being in the Beatles while it was happening was beyond anything that we can even comprehend. But when you're dealing with the aftermath, that's a whole other world altogether. And your legendary status grows through the years. And as someone who has studied all four Beatles and their solo music, and I feel there's so much great material that they've given, all four of them through the years. For so many people in this world, it just doesn't seem to matter how much great music they've done on their own. And sometimes they don't recognize the individual talents of the four of them. And some people aren't even aware of all the commercial success that they had on their own. To a lot of people, these four guys will always be Beatles first. how did George deal with that? That must have been difficult at times.
You know, George was not someone who complained about the difficulty of stuff,
Hmm.
but the repetitive nature of needing to visit. You know, he even had a name for himself. You know, when he was in those years was Beetle George,
Hmm.
and through the years after the dissolution of the band, you know, he keeps referring to, you know, Beetle George, and this is what Beetle George would do. You
Right.
know? So he was very aware of a role, playing a role, being a character, and he was not one to complain, but he was someone who, in his best moments, was very self-aware to say, like, you know, the way that people put on a hard hat and go to a construction site, you know, to start their work day. There are days that I have to put on the George Harrison suit
Hmm.
and go and sit and do, you know, 13 interviews in a row in one day, sitting in a windowless office in Burbank, California at Warner Brothers or whatever. And I should be happy for that because this way I can still reach an audience. This way I can still make music that matters, etc., etc. So he was very balanced in the way that he looked at stuff. Of course, he had his moments. Like I said, you know, he was very authentic.
Hmm.
So, for example, you know, when the Beatles are falling apart, he talks about the Beatles with a certain sense of wistfulness, but also relief that he is getting out from under the 2 3 years, you know, at the end of the 60s, when his need to express himself as a songwriter, to record his own music, etc., was being stymied left and right
Sure.
because he was still not a, you know, he was looked upon as being the junior member of the songwriting aspect of the Beatles.
Right.
At the same time, you know, you see interviews from him in the '80s, and his looking back at the Beatles is very much colored by the fact that there's this ongoing litigation that has gotten kind of personal between him and Paul,
Hmm.
and he's really upset. And then by the late '80s, by '89, '90, when the agreement is finally signed and the Beatles themselves can now start to be involved with what is coming out of the vaults, out of the archives, there's again the sense of relief. And then there's finally a sense of humor about it, you know, when his son Danny discovers the Beatles for the first time and knows, oh, Daddy used to be in this band, you know, and he takes him to the Prince's Trust where he's up there with Eric Clapton and he's
Hmm.
doing While My Guitar Gently Weeps and he's doing, you know, Here
Here
Comes
comes
the
the sun.
Sun, and Danny says to him, you know, yeah, that was great, but what about Twist and Shout? What about Roll Over Beethoven? You
Right.
know, and George is just getting a huge laugh out of that. You know,
Yeah. I just wanted to bring up because you were just saying that he recognized the fact that being in the Beatles gave him the opportunity to promote himself. Just remembering when he was on the Dick Cavett show, and he
yeah,
said, "Let's face it, if I wasn't a Beatle, you wouldn't even want me
right.
here."
Well, I think the point is one, he hated the whole television format in the United States
Hmm.
because it was constantly being cut off, you know, by commercial interruptions, and he talks about that again and again. You know, what he really also was there for. He goes, "Why are you bringing me on in 1971? You know, I do not have a new album. I don't have a new project to talk about. I don't have a tour going on. Oh, but if you really want me, I'll bring on Ravi Shankar and we'll talk about an album that we worked on together." Or
Right.
actually, no, he's talking about the documentary that he helped put together. I think called Raga.
That's right.
And Dick spends maybe 10% of the time that he has with George on that topic, and George gets a little bit, you know, testy about it.
Yeah, it was amusing when you said, the Beatles was such a long time ago. This is 1971. I mean,
Yeah,
they broke up in
yeah,
1970, at least
yeah.
publicly anyway. But yeah, that's something. But going back to something you just said about how George was so frustrated at the end of the Beatles, which we all believe, right around the time when Paul released his first album, he gave an interview to Howard Smith where he actually said, and I always bring this up in my shows, that it would be selfish for the Beatles to break up, to split. So it's this complex nature. There's this one side where he still wants to maintain, the band, and at the same time he wants to break free.
Yeah, that I think that really again feeds into this idea that George was very comfortable being himself, being authentic about his feelings, and he's remarkably open, by the way, about the business side of stuff and
Hmm.
the legal side of stuff, all the legal tussles and the business aspect of what he's going through. He's very revealing, very open about what he's dealing with. Most you know uh, showbiz people these days, they keep
Yeah.
that out of the spotlight because one, they don't want to sound like they're complaining. Oh my God, look at what I have to go through and pay top dollar to the lawyers. But at the same time, the lawyers themselves would recommend, don't be speaking out of school,
Hmm.
on these kind of topics. But he's very open about it. I would just say that he's again someone who like in that Howard Smith interview that you talk about. That's part of this book, and he's still working on All Things Must Pass at the time, and he's
Right.
very proud of it. But at the same time, he's not sure how it's gonna be the huge blockbuster, that it's gonna generate the first number one single post Beatles by one of the band members.
Yeah.
So there's nothing that's given. And that really turns into his magnum opus, and it is both a kind of a personal statement, if you will. It reflects his spiritual philosophy as
Hmm.
much as it does, topics like Paul McCartney giving him a wah wah or
Yeah.
a headache,
Right.
and
Run of
him
the
writing
mill.
to,
Run.
writing to that moment. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And the idea of like being self sufficient.
Hmm.
It's he's relying on his friends, he's relying on his musical community, and he's recording it at Friar Park. He's set himself up with a studio at home so he
Right.
can create his music, bring his friends in, bring his colleagues in, and that this kind of declaration of independence is so huge. And it's a 3 disc set, and there were so few 3 disc sets at that time period. It's just an amazing statement that he comes out with. On the other side, on the less serious side, is that 10 years later, after the Beatles break up in 1979, he's on a radio show with Michael Jackson.
Yep.
And this is one of my favorite moments in the book. You see this interview, double interview taking place at the BBC. It's actually in a jukebox jury kind of situation where George and
Hmm.
Michael are listening to other people's music, but they're being interviewed as well. And Michael talks about being in the Jacksons at that time in 1979. He's just begun work on Off the Wall, which will become
Hmm.
his own declaration of independence from the Jacksons, from the Jackson Five, and from his brothers.
Hmm.
And he's talking about the same thing, that he's having trouble kind of expressing his own musical vision and realizing the songs that he's hearing in a group that is more about the collective and with other more established songwriters in the group. Very
Yeah.
similar, very
This,
parallel situation to
yes,
George's.
I know. I really think that after All Things Must Pass, it exploded so much that I think George never looked back. And even
Oh,
though
absolutely.
he worked with John on the Imagine album and did a lot of work with Ringo through the years, but still, I think that was the turning point in his life.
Well, they do. The Beatles were always in touch. I mean, they might have
Hmm.
fallen out of touch for a while, but especially once they get that legal agreement done, or
Hmm.
what the journalist Mark Rowland in the book refers to as the long and winding agreement.
Yeah.
When that's finally reached, the Beatles get together in the anthology series starts to happen, and they get together. And
Right.
there's a few videos you can find on YouTube of where George, Ringo, and Paul are all together. Doesn't happen too often, but
Mm-hmm.
they did collectively, see that they should be working together on the Beatles reissues.
Yeah, it's funny you bring that up about the Mark Rowland interview, because there was one moment there when he's talking about Paul, and I want to just read it here because I found this to be really powerful. Mark says, "So, what kind of relationship do you and Paul have these days?" George said, "We don't have a relationship." Then Mark says, "Really?" And George says, "I think of him as a good friend, really, but a friend who I don't really have that much in common with anymore. Sort of like you meet people in your life who mean a certain thing. It's just like you're married and then you're divorced and you wish the other person well, but life has taken you to other places, to friendlier, whatever the expression is, confines." Okay, that really moved me. And you could tell right
Yeah,
after that that Mark wanted to change the subject because probably it was disturbing George a bit.
yeah.
So I'm thinking this is right after the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and Paul didn't show up. What was it about the two of them there? Why was George just upset about that?
Well, that is definitely a low point. I mean, please keep in mind that we're talking about, a guy who, when he was ready to let go of life, George was kind of had tried all the, the anti-cancer regimes that are available, in this day and age, to someone of his means.
Hmm,
And when he finally had to accept the fact that he was leaving, Paul was at his side.
right.
Amongst the last people to visit were Paul and Ringo. So people go up, people go down. Their relationships go all over the place, and I think that, as you point out so accurately, Mark Rowland's interview is from '89. The
Right.
previous year was when Paul did not show up for the Beatles induction. I think George was most hurt by the fact that, they had not finally signed the agreement of how to, take Apple Core,
Hmm,
take it apart, and then but still move forward, with the powers shared equally between all the different estates. But the fact that John had been shot and killed, in 1980, and this was probably the closest thing to a kind of public acknowledgement of the Beatles.
hmm,
Was their induction in like only the second year into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, was important enough that you had to put aside all the temporary legal shit and make this happen. And he was very upset. And it's on YouTube. This is one of the times where
hmm.
you can read it and compare it to how George is actually speaking, and you can really see and feel the hurt that's there as he's standing up there. And it's only 2 out of 4,
Yeah.
or 2 out of the 3 surviving, Beatles. But he's feeling it, you know.
Yeah. And yet, shortly after that, you have the transcription of when George and Ringo were on Aspel and Company on the British TV show, and he publicly says, "I love Paul."
Yeah, yeah. I think he actually turns to the camera and he looks dead in the camera as if Paul might be on the other side, other end of the TV, and says that. But yeah, I mean, the thing is that even while George's heart is breaking, and he's saying John is not here, but thank you for putting us into this, uh, august institution. Before the Rock
Hmm,
Hall of Fame even had a home in Cleveland,
right.
they were being inducted. But Ringo is at his side, treating the microphone like it's open mic night at the local comedy club.
Yep.
So there's always this kind of like balance. It's never all this. And George was cool with that. But yeah, that Michael Aspel and Company, that was the
Right.
name of the show on ITV in England, and that I had to have that in the book because it
Hmm.
was the closest thing to that kind of like out of control, joking, British humor stuff that the Beatles were so good at in their beginning years in 63 and 64. And here it's just George and Ringo going at it and bantering between the two of them, and Aspel's able to keep up with them.
Yeah.
So it's a rare moment. That's
No.
on YouTube as well, but I
Yeah.
love that it's in the book and you can actually, because you cannot, there are times when you cannot make out what they're saying. And
Mm.
I literally had to take the recording, slow it down, work through the Liverpudlian accents and all
Yeah.
to make sure it was accurate.
I remember when I saw that the first time, which must have been, amongst Beatle friends, were collectors, and it must have been in the '90s. And the two of them together were hysterical. They were just so natural, bouncing off each other. It's like you don't have to rehearse. This is just them.
Exactly.
But wrestling with this past is just something that I find fascinating because George Harrison is someone who very often downplays the Beatles. I remember hearing him say, "We had a few good tunes." At the same time, he's also said he's worked with better musicians than the Beatles. He'd rather work with Willie Weeks as a bass player than Paul McCartney. But yet, if you attack the Beatles to George Harrison, you watch and see how he defends them.
Yeah.
So,
You know,
this constant conflict back and forth, the good side of the Beatles, the bad side of the Beatles, and he shows it in these interviews.
like I said, I think he's just true to the moment, And if he's really upset with Paul, he's gonna speak about being upset with Paul, and maybe downplay the Beatles vis-a-vis his heroes like Ravi Shankar. Now there's a musician. There's someone who practices constantly,
Right.
who's an absolute maestro. George absolutely downplays his role as a rhythm guitarist in some of the interviews, like the Mark Rowland interview.
Yeah.
And yet some of those guitar parts he came up with, like on Abbey Road, etc.,
Hmm.
or on his own solo material, are amazing,
Yep.
and are a jewel like to this day, you know. So I think there's always that balance between, yes, I did great work, I was a great craftsman, but I was not like Eric Clapton, where you can
Mm.
take Eric, pick him up, and put him into any musical situation, and he'll be able to apply his guitar work in a way that makes sense within that. George is a studio craftsman, you
Mm.
know, and he's very aware of that. When they ask him, so what's in the future for you, Beatle George? And he's all of like 21, 22, and he goes, I'm starting to like being in the studio. Maybe I will be a producer. You know, Ringo was going to open up all the
Hair
hair
salons.
salons,
Yeah.
across the UK, and George saw his future, at least for a little while, as being a music producer. He was going to be, uh, you know, the next, you know, who knows, you
Yeah.
know.
But they were looking beyond, after the Beatles. They had the
Yeah,
wisdom to know that this may not last all that long. Because most
well,
bands in
none
those
of them
days,
thought it would last more than a year or two.
yeah,
Because that was the shelf life of
right.
pop stars at that time. You know,
Yeah. Tell me about the 1974 North American tour for which George was panned. And I truly believe that severely affected him. Do you think that he decided not to tour all those years until with Eric Clapton in Japan because of the poor reviews, or was there a part of him that really did enjoy performing on stage?
it's interesting you asked this. I absolutely agree with you that I think it had a very devastating effect on George and his notion of what it was to do a tour. I think there was a couple of things that came out of that 1974 year. He established a record company,
Mm,
Dark Horse Records. He had a relationship with A&M, which made that possible. A&M Records, Herb Alpert and Jerry Moss, two of the big movers and shakers in the music industry at that time.
sure.
Pardon me. And also he meets Olivia. Olivia's working at A&M, and this is going to be the mother of his son, his wife, after, post Patty, and the love of his life, and his spiritual partner as well. And also the woman who's going to save his life,
True.
in 2000 when, or at the end of
The Intruder.
1999,
Yep.
when the intruder, whose name is escaping me, breaks into Friar Park.
I know it.
But
I don't want to repeat it.
yeah, okay, thank you. But the experience of doing all of that in 1974 and recording an album and then putting together a band that included other stars, Billy Preston, Ravi Shankar, etc., and rehearsing it and taking them on the road. By the time he hits the road, he is sick. He's got a cold, and he has to sing and run the whole tour while he himself is in, front stage and center, and that takes its toll on him. Then when he feels absolutely stabbed in the back by Rolling Stone, especially Rolling Stone magazine, with the Ben Fong Torres's reviews, which really give him no quarter whatsoever, no understanding of what he's going through, and then he realizes later on that the idea of rock shows. I mean, let's remember that the last big rock show he did was a one-off. One night with two
Bangladesh.
sets. The concert for Bangladesh in 1971, and before that, it was playing in San Francisco. With the Beatles. So that was it, except for special performances. But
Right.
I'm talking about tours.
Yep.
And this is very interesting, and I made sure that I put this in the book. It comes from an interview that was not used by Anthony DeCurtis from Rolling Stone. And it's a little story that he tells Anthony of being I should know the name of the venue. It's in Santa Monica Civic Arena, I think it is. It's one of the stops on the 1974 tour. And at the end of the show, they're kind of like chilling out backstage. Audience has left. He goes back onto the stage to get a guitar or something, and he looks out, and the devastation that has happened in the arena, and the amount of garbage and clothing and shoes and even underwear is there's a bulldozer pushing this all together into a pile, and then this front loader is going to come in and put it in a dumpster, and he goes, "This is what I'm creating," and that image, that story, is kind of buried away in this very unread interview by Anthony DeCurtis in '88. And he goes, because he asks him that question, Anthony does, of George, why have you stopped touring? And he mentions the idea of like keeping a band together and the financial obligation you have, and I'm not ready for that. But then he mentions this little story. And I think, given his spiritual nature and the idea of like this mound of garbage that was created, in this general admission, non-seated arena situation, he goes, I'm not really dying to be a part of that. Where rock concerts had gone in the 1970s, he did not want to participate in, not on that level.
Right. Turn them off altogether.
Yeah.
He also, in the Beatle days, he performed for half an hour.
Yeah.
That's also another thing, except during the Hamburg days.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He was ready to do the 2.5 hour shows and give proper focus to other performers on the stage. Right. But I think that the physical exhaustion, the actual getting sick, and then the critical reception of 1974, like you said, It was just like this 1, 2, 3 punch that
Hmm.
he never really fully recovered from.
And
When you think about it, the only other tour that he ever did in his life that was consistently, was on that level of rock stardom and
right,
was like every night or every other night was when he joins Clapton's band in Japan in '92, and that becomes a recording, you know. But he's got the A Team, the Rock
right.
Eight, Greg Gaines, Nate Harris on bass.
Hmm.
He has this amazing. Is it
Sure.
Steve Gadd? I forget who's on
Steve
drums.
Ferrone.
Steve Verone on
Yeah.
drums. Amazing, amazing A-list musicians along with Eric. And they all learn his music, and by the second or third night, he is having such a great time. But that was kind of Eric's gift to George. You don't have to invest in your own band. Come and use mine. Come, and in Japan they will treat you right, and
Hmm.
and treat you like you won't have to argue with hotel choices.
Right.
Like sometimes you have to do. You know.
Do you know the reason why he didn't continue after that tour? Because I always heard they were going to come over to the US. So
Yeah,
I waited.
yeah. So did we all. There's in the book. He does a rock line show.
Right.
So, which is
Yeah.
great, which I really wanted to include because it shows George not responding to a seasoned journalist, but actually dealing directly with fans.
Hmm.
And they're asking him left, right, and center, when are you going to perform in the States again? And it really sounds like he's determined to do that or go back to the UK and tour there.
Yeah.
So who knows? I mean, there's usually more reasons for a tour not to happen than to happen, unfortunately, especially at that level, to this day, the money has to be right. There has to be that kind of balance of availability,
Yeah.
energy, and interest.
And I was up that night listening to Rockline. That was a great show. Bob Coburn, the host of it, and I think George had a little too much to drink before the show, jamming with Jeff Lynne there, and it was still a great show.
Yeah.
But I remember the interview you have in here with Scott Muni around that time for Live in Japan, and he was hinting, I might be at Madison Square Garden, so he was thinking about it.
He was. Listen, from the 70s through the 90s and into the aughts, there was this rock circuit. I mean, it still exists today, for a certain level of artists. But, what's, kind of slightly dismaying is that, of course, that generation of artists from the 60s and 70s are really getting to the age where a lot of them just won't be touring anymore. And the guaranteed sellout names,
Hmm.
a lot of them just aren't around anymore. A few are left. So post pandemic, once we get past this craziness
Yeah.
we're in right now, this very unsettled time, besides Rod Stewart and Sting, if he wanted to go back out, that generation, the 60s and 70s superstars, there's less and less of them around.
Sure.
And because of the kind of, what would the word be, kind of fracturing of audiences
Hmm.
into subgenres and whatnot, I don't think you have many major artists that can deliver at that rock arena, and fill up 25 to 50,000, 60,000 seat venues
Yeah.
like there used to be.
Yeah. Paul McCartney was still doing it.
Yeah, Paul. And
Yeah.
he never tired from it of it.
Well, he
Um,
lives for the audience. He craves
yeah,
it. So, yeah.
yeah.
Can you talk a bit about? I see a parallel between Dark Horse Records and Handmade Films.
Oh yeah. Well,
George owning both companies, and I think that his approach with both was kind of the same. He wanted to have a company that he could control and not get too big.
I would agree with everything you said except the word control. I think he loved the idea of collaboration,
Hmm.
and that he didn't want to steer everything. in just his own fashion and make it work with, to his choices and his vision.
Right.
I think that, and I make this point in the introduction to the book, is that with George, I think you see the most successful flowering of the original Apple idea. The idea behind Apple Corps was not just to help develop the Beatles' music and their ancillary projects,
Mm.
solo stuff as well as non musical, creative projects, but
Right.
also their friends. The idea of creating Apple Records and putting Jackie Lomax as well as the Hare Krishna singers,
Yeah.
all on this label and having hits. James Taylor, you know. So if you think about how that kind of faded away with the breakup of the Beatles in 1970, the continuation of that idea amongst the four ex Beatles at that point, George is the only one who takes on that idea and continues to develop it over time. Now, uh, Dark Horse Records, which is really in the end becomes just a vehicle for his own music
Mm.
and less a label for other people. At least at the start, the original vision included a bunch of different groups of a wide variety of styles
Right.
that came out in 1974 and 75. Music that he helped discover or helped produce. And Handmade Films was another idea that sort of came out of wanting to not get into the film industry, but to help out friends of his who he adored.
Hmm.
And I'm talking about Monty
Sure.
Python here, and who had a project at hand, and suddenly, the rug had been pulled out from underneath them financially by one of the major studios. I'm forgetting right now. I think it's Warner. I think it
Yeah.
was Warner
Yep.
Brothers. And they just could not embrace the idea of a movie that talked about Jesus in the way that Monty Python was developing Life of Brian.
Yeah.
And of course, with a very sort of elastic view of spirituality and a very committed idea to let me help my friends out. He being George and his manager at the time developed this idea of creating handmade films to help this one film out.
Right.
In the process, they launched an effort. Handmade films that pretty much for the next 10 years has an amazing impact on independent British cinema. And you think about Bob Hoskins and the
Hmm.
various movies that he was in, movies like With Nail and I,
Right.
which was a sort of art house hit, in the late 80s, et cetera, et cetera. The impact of handmade films was almost on the level of like the only other very independent producer of films coming out of England that had that similar kind of impact. I think it was Merchant Ivory. And so, most people aren't aware of this. That Handmade had its incredible moments, and this was all because George was willing to take on both the joy but also the headaches
Yeah.
of what it is to get into the film business. And he personally was very involved with, probably Handmade Films' biggest and most notorious kind of semi-disaster, Shanghai Surprise,
Right.
that had a very young Madonna and Sean Penn when they had just gotten married.
Hmm.
They were in the movie together.
I kind of look at, the way that George handled, well, both companies as like a reluctant businessman. That's kind of like what I would call him. And some of the interviews you have here in the book, he's just so on the ball with Handmade, knowing everything going on with the company, all the latest projects, and he's proud to talk about it. Could you elaborate on that? But also, I was surprised at somewhere in one of the interviews, Ray Cooper is brought up, and he had a really big role there. at the film company. You think of him for being a percussionist all the years with Elton John, especially. Also worked with George. But can you talk about that?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, I've kind of touched upon this already. The idea that George was very comfortable talking about his business aspects,
Mm,
as a professional musician and someone who was, had a certain stature in the world of showbiz. For let's call it what it is.
mm,
And I think that George would say, on the one hand, I hate looking at contracts. I hate looking. Well, who likes looking at contracts except, perhaps someone who's in an entertainment attorney or whatever, who lives for the dotting of the I's and the crossing of the T's,
mm.
and working out all the terminology. He wants to be in the studio working on another, guitar part, on another tune, but there's this necessary part, but that I think he was involved with since the very beginnings of the Beatles,
Mm,
and though they had Brian Epstein to help them out, they were involved with their own business from a very, youthful age, and dealing with questions of, how do we set this company up, and how do we, so he might have been reluctant, but he was a willing participant at the
right.
same time. Ray Cooper, is simply someone who he came across in his music world, who is really good at reading scripts. And George talks about this in the interview, with Elaine Dutka
Hmm.
for Film Comment magazine. That's part of
Right.
the book, and he mentions the idea that he cannot be that first line of reviewing on all the scripts that Handmade was getting. By about their fourth or fifth year,
Hmm.
more business was coming in. They didn't need to reach out for business. Their door was being knocked on all the time. But
Right.
there were such stacks of screenplays and film ideas, treatments, etc., to read through. He wasn't going to do it, and Ray turned out to be really great at reading fast and determining, the yes no pile,
Uh-huh.
and then the yes pile he would then pass on to George. So, having someone like that within a film production company is invaluable. So that's why he gets name checked, and I think that's why George's ability to not only create companies but teams around him, and why I keep saying the word collaborator
Hmm.
is more appropriate.
Speaking of collaborating, there's the Traveling Wilburys, which I know that George really loved being a part of. And I remember him saying around that time how much he missed being in a band. The difference being that these were five equals
Yeah,
and treated
exactly.
that way.
Right. Well, that was the refreshing change for George from the Beatles, is that they had all established themselves, both as performers and songwriters and recording artists. They were all on such legendary stature that that ego stuff starts to like fade away, and it's just like an old boys club, of people who are interested in creating interesting songs and
Mm,
having a good time in the studio together. you know. I think that more time was spent with them sharing liquid lunches, and really just enjoying the company of people of similar experience and similar age. And I think had George not come up with the idea, it wouldn't have happened. I think it took someone of George's uh, you know kind of egoless nature,
mm,
along with his stature, his historical importance, to demand the kind of respect from Jeff and Tom and Bob and
hmm.
Roy Orbison for the first album, where it's just pure love of music. And
Yeah.
so George really makes that happen. But then, of course, once again, he gets saddled, with the idea of running the project.
Right.
So when the Traveling Wilburys 3 comes out, which is their second album,
Yep.
talk about love of a sense of humor.
Mm,
It's George who's really calling the sessions together, making sure the album comes together. But by the end of that, he's like done. It's like, okay, we've taken this idea and run it into the ground, and everybody has their own priorities anyway.
I know in one of the interviews he said after Cloud Nine, both Traveling Wilburys, the Live in Japan tour, and everything, he was exhausted. But he was asked about the possibility of another Traveling Wilburys album, and he joked about it. Who could be a Wilbury? Madonna, no. Cyndi Lauper, yes. All this stuff. Was there any real thought at all, or did he know kind of after the second album that was it?
I, I don't know.
I'm just wondering if you have any insight
No,
on all that.
no, I don't. I think that George at that point, I mean, think about it. He's in his 40s. He has had how many different lives and how many different, golden opportunities to create, and he has not missed any of them. The only thing he hasn't done is developed a touring presence, but he probably could if he wanted to. He was someone who was very self-directed, and I think especially after 1974, he did not want to go through the same old, checklist of things that maturing rock stars do. He was not interested in that kind of filling in that kind of trope. And he that famous thing about why does the Who keep reuniting, because they have bills to pay. He didn't have, his bills were paid. So he didn't need to do it financially, either. And I mean, the stories of him doing midnight gardening at Friar Park kind of shows you where his head was at. I mean, this is George in the 80s and early 90s. He'd be in the studio during the day playing with Danny, and late at night when everyone's asleep, he would get up and run the tractor around the grounds, or go and prune a tree. Work
Right.
on and he had lighting all over Friar Park, so he could do that. You know, he
That's
was living his own life with his own priorities.
I wonder sometimes, because I know that George has said that the process of creating music that he loves. He doesn't like promoting it. He doesn't like doing the interviews, making the videos. But then again, Cloud Nine time, he certainly was. Was that because he was kind of forced to do it?
I don't think he was ever forced to do anything he didn't want to do.
Because that was like the first time in a long time when he really went and promoted himself and made videos,
I
gave
think
a
he
lot
was
of
proud
interviews.
of it, and listen, once again, the word collaboration, I think, is very appropriate here, and this is also on the business side. This is less so now in the days of streaming and the internet, etc. But back in the day when music was a physical product primarily,
Mm,
that music was something that you wanted to sell in its physical form. LPs, later CDs, but all the other ancillary,
mm,
formats. You needed a partner. You needed a record company that was going to distribute it, put it in brick and mortar stores.
hmm
That's how you reached your audience. You can't change. You couldn't change that during that time period. That was the game you had to play. So George was aware of that. So if he had a new album that he was very proud of, like Cloud Nine, and that Warner was going to get behind it, because it's the first album in 8 years or whatever.
fine.
He's going to do the interviews. Again, this goes back to the idea of this is what I do. This is part of the George suit that I put on in the morning.
Mm,
And I'm comfortable with that, So I don't think it was like he was forced to. I don't think that comes into it. He didn't have a manager anymore. He had someone who helped manage his business side. He had a business manager who he
hmm
later fell out with, forgetting Dennis something.
Dennis O'Brien.
Dennis O'Brien, thank
Yeah,
you, who was his business partner in Handmade
right.
films as well, you know. But, his career decision making, once he left the Beatles, he was, for a little while, he was connected with Alan Klein, but he very quickly got out of that after the, issues that came to the fore, first with um, uh, the money aspects of
Hmm.
Concert for Bangladesh, but then especially with the lawsuit over, My Sweet Lord
Sure.
versus He's So Fine.
Hmm. Yeah. It's funny because prior to Cloud Nine, his last album was Gone Troppo, which was 5 years before that, and he did no interviews for that album, which I thought was a fine album, and it's a shame. A lot
Yeah,
of fans weren't even aware that it came out. Some of them
yeah.
were, but
Well, but, I mean that speaks more to George's freedoms,
mhm,
you know, and than anything else. And I think that so you're asking me, again, there's a lot that goes on in a person's mind, and a lot goes on in their lives that you can try and take apart. But I don't think it's in the long run. What I see is kind of you pull back and see the big picture, and you see that for the most part, George was someone who had earned a level of freedoms,
mhm,
you know, to uh, uh, participate, to create, to live his life, and he took full advantage of all of those possibilities, and he lived a good life. He lived a life of creation, of service, of a certain moral and spiritual standing, and he held to it. And for all those reasons, I think we can be inspired and learn lessons from it.
yeah. Well, one of the reasons why I admire George, as well as all the Beatles, is that really and truly they only did what they wanted to do. They were honest in that regard.
They absolutely
So,
were.
and sometimes I think about the fact that after Live in Japan and the Wilburys albums, George chose not to record a new album, only towards the end to work on the songs, from the last decade or more to compile them for the fans, really. But it was his choice, really, not to record new music. He probably did it privately, but not for the public.
No,
So
his
again,
his his last big project is the 30th anniversary of All Things Must Pass.
mm, right. All right. Well, this is a fantastic book. And again, it is called George Harrison on George Harrison Interviews and Encounters by Ashley Kahn, edited by
Yeah.
Ashley Kahn.
Here, I'll
Always looks
match you.
better.
There you go.
Double vision right there. Ashley, it
Thank you,
has
Ken.
it, it has been great having you as a guest. I wish you continued success with this book,
Thank you.
and
Thank you.
please
And
stay in
thank you,
touch.
thank you for doing what you're doing, because obviously your questions and your understanding of what George and the Beatles in general are about really comes through, and I think that's so important, because especially the way that headlines are today, and the state of the world, we could use a lot more love, peace, and understanding, to quote somebody else, but that's what the Beatles stood for, and that's what George stood for. And I think that his music and his message and the life he lived is something that I'm very happy that it can help keep out there in the public sphere, and you're doing the same job, so thank
Yeah.
you.
Well, I like to tell people that when I first fell in love with the Beatles, it was all about the music, and nothing mattered more than the music. And as you study them more, they're fascinating people. And the more that you learn about them, you just love them and admire them even more. And your book is helping to do that. So where George is concerned. So
Thanks,
thank you
Ken.
for releasing it. And thank you for being a special guest on our show.
It's
And
been a pleasure.
by the way, I should let everyone know, if you can't get enough of Ashley, he was a guest on one of my podcast shows called Things We Said Today. You can look it up on our YouTube page. It's show 329, more talk about George in the show. So if you can, go to the YouTube page for things we said today. Subscribe to that as well as Ken Michaels Radio. Thanks again to all you guys for watching. And Ashley, thanks for being here.
Thank
And
you, Ken.
we'll see you next time.
All the best. Be well.